Hello, thank you to coming again to another interview here on the Smart City TV. Today I have with me the pleasure of interviewing Judy Backhouse. Judy is a research fellow on the UN University in Portugal. Judy comes from South Africa with a depth and broad experience on the smart cities. And she will be talking to us today about her experience and what he sees as the future in smart cities. Judy, please, the camera is open to you.
Well, hello, and thank you for this invitation. I've had a look at a couple of the videos on the Smart City TV, and I think it's a very interesting initiative and certainly a good way to use this time during lockdown to learn more about smart cities and share information. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, good. Judy, we have been talking before, and one of the issues and things that we are both interested in are on the standards for smart cities. So recently ISO has published, ITU has some standards as well. Brazil, that we have been talking also, is adopting a version of the ISO standards for smart cities. What do you see is the future about the standards for smart cities? What is your perspective on that?
Well, I think that there will be multiple different developments. I certainly think at an international level, bodies will go ahead with developing standards which they see as being useful at an international level. I'm involved in the United for Smart Sustainable Cities program, which runs within ITU. And certainly I think there's quite a commitment to develop common standards for cities. So I think that process will go ahead, and I think there's some value to it in that having common global standards enables comparison across cities. But I think what we will see is we will see more and more regional initiatives that perhaps work against the global initiatives. And I think the reasoning for that is that the global standards are set by global bodies, and I think that there are regions, particularly regions in the South, South America where you come from, Africa where I come from, where perhaps the situation in those contexts is not as well understood. And so I think there is an argument to be made, and scholars better than myself have made it, that we need to think about what standards are appropriate in different contexts. And so you mentioned the case of Brazil, and I think what we will see is we'll see more regional initiatives to try and come up with standards that are relevant for particular regions.
Okay, so as an engineer myself, and also somebody that does some research on a smart city, I see that the standards are taken into two different perspectives. One is the perspective of the engineer, somebody that needs to build a smart city, and so far he is concerned about what standards he needs to follow to build something. On the other side, as a researcher and somebody that wants to evaluate results, we try to use standards to measure outcomes. So these are totally two different sets of standards. So how do you see that? How these things can come together, will not come together? Tell me a little bit.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the terminology gets confused in people's minds because those who come from an engineering background are expecting a standard to be, this is how I make this component speak to that component kind of thing. And I think that standards play a very important role in that respect. And so certainly where smart cities depend a lot on technology, to have standards underpinning those technologies about exactly how things are constructed, how they communicate, the nuts and bolts of the technology is important. And I think those will remain common. Not always entirely common, because of course there are different groups within the world who are vying for having their standards accepted. But I think that's one kind of standards. I think the standards that I deal with far more are the standards around the measurement and monitoring of smart cities. And that is where, things are not so clearly defined. If we are going to evaluate a smart city, what are we going to evaluate it against? And that is not so much a technical issue. It's very often an ideological issue. It's an issue of how one understands the smart city and what one expects of the smart city, and And that's where different agendas come in. So political agendas or social agendas in different parts of the world look very different, and it's far more difficult to get them to match up than it is to get, you know, components to match up and do the same thing.
Yeah. So another interesting topic related to the standards is I'm seeing in several occasions where some cities are trying to come together, creating what they call the smart territory instead just of a smart city, because people may live in one city and work in another one, and neighbor one, and if you don't have a common set of legal framework or regulatory or standard framework to cope, you can build cities that do not talk to each other. Yeah?
Yes, so I think it's very
big problem.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely that you're going to get wide discrepancies in cities that are close enough to be part of a smart territory. I think that within regions, you would definitely find that. In fact, I mean, I think this question of measuring and evaluating smart cities is really not a responsibility that should be taken up at the city level. I did some work recently for the South African Cities Network. And what that work was about what is the role of local government, what is the role of national government when it comes to these kind of things. And I think what we concluded from that work was that when it comes to evaluating where you want your smart cities to go, you want to have regional or national kind of perspectives on this, because generally there is some kind of national agenda as to what a country is trying to achieve, and you want to have those goals reflected in city goals. That's not to say cities don't have specific issues. You know, a city that's at the coast may have an issue that another city further inland doesn't have, but you would expect that at a national, regional level, you would want some level of commonality across what goals there are. Yeah. So I certainly don't see it as being something that can be devolved to a city level where you end up getting something very different at between neighboring cities.
Yeah, I've done some time ago work in South Africa as well, and one of the issues were the common transportation card that you can use theoretically in the whole country, the same transportation card, but in actuality, when you try to deploy that, is a very complex problem to do that. So you also told me that you did some research for Brazil, for the NIC in Brazil. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What it was?
Yes, so we wrote a chapter for the next edition of the ICT Electronic Government publication that they bring out on a regular basis. I don't think this one is out yet, but I think it's kind of in production at the moment. And really what we were looking at there was we were looking at this question of measuring cities and the balance between local and global measures for cities. So we looked at what kind of measures are out there, what measures are in use, the initiatives that are being undertaken. And I think that was where we started to think about what are the complications of having international bodies make decisions about what those measures should be. So I can give you an example. One of the things in a lot of the standards that have been proposed for measuring smart cities, the indicators that are proposed, is that nowhere do they measure questions like the extent to which smart interventions have promoted equity in a city. Now in cities in South America, there have been lots of examples of how changes in transportation have actually led to greater equity across the city and the ability for people to participate more in the city. And those measures are not reflected in the international measures. So those are the sorts of measures that researchers are highlighting as being something that might be relevant in a context. I mean, certainly coming from South Africa, measures of equity are very important. And one of the great fears around smart cities is that smart cities actually increase inequality. And there is research to show that. And what we're interested in is how to retain the good aspects of smart cities, but to make sure that it's not increasing inequality, because that would be a real problem in places where inequality is already difficult.
Correct. So taking into consideration that the smart city focus to having the citizen on the center, everyone needs to be equally treated and receive the same kind of benefits. And normally some of the things doesn't happen. Somebody will receive more broadband and others will not. So we have more access to technology and others don't. So that's really a bit complicated issue. But since we try to establish different sets of indicators or metrics or KPIs, what do you consider the most important ones? And of course, that depends on regions. So for instance, what would be more important in less developed countries and what would be the more important in more developed countries?
That's a sort of question that I like to avoid answering, because I think that cities and regions must decide for themselves. I think it's very dangerous to come up with a list, because then people turn around and say, oh, this expert said, and I really think that's not the point. I think regions do need to decide for themselves, but certainly the sort of things that we've noticed in the research are the one that I mentioned, the issue of measuring equality, measuring access. I think that's important, certainly in all my dealings with smart cities in the African context. The starting point is to get people connected, because if they're not connected, they can't really take advantage of a lot of the smart city, what the smart city has to offer. So I think those elements are important. And then I think what we've also noticed is that the international standards often focus more on the outcomes rather than on measures of inputs and measures of progress. And so for areas where smart cities are new, people are starting out with smart city projects and that kind of thing, they often find it very difficult to measure outputs or to measure impact. That's the kind of thing that you can measure much further down the line. And so I did an exercise with someone from Oman who was looking to come up with a subset of the international standards, which could be used to measure the smart city project that they're working on there. And one of the problems that they found was very few measures on the sort of input and process side, which is really what they were looking for, because they're starting out in their project. So I think those are the kinds of differences one might find, when it comes to developing country areas.
Yeah, and I remember many years ago when we were talking about the eGov Readiness Index, and the index that has exactly the same issues about metrics, because countries tend to create solutions that will increase their position on the rankings instead of providing the necessary solution for the country.
Yes. Yeah.
We have seen that.
That is the danger particularly of rankings, is that rankings, are done on the basis of a very defined set of KPIs or indices, and then, of course, one finds that cities are just trying to improve their positions on the rankings, so they will be focusing on those particular measures, and those particular measures may not be what the city most needs at the time.
So based on your experience with different countries, Judy, what you have seen the index that countries look the most to achieve? It's broadband connectivity, it's maybe a resilience-related index, or is a health index? How do you see a panorama of these indexes across the world?
I don't know if I have enough perspective to really give you a panorama. So from the research that I was doing in the African context, I looked at smart city agendas of African cities. That's one of the things that I researched. And I was just going and finding online the agendas that different cities had published and looking at what they were focusing on. And certainly the recurring theme was access. So there wasn't really a city in Africa that wasn't trying to improve access. And then I think the other one that goes hand in hand with that is capacity development, both in terms of the skills of the general population to be able to connect to the internet and use technology, and in terms of technical skills more broadly in the population. And then a lot of the others were specific to particular areas. So, for example, Cape Town was concerned about security and crime, and Nairobi was concerned about flooding. So I think, you know, there are things that are very specific to the context.
Yeah.
What I found quite surprising in that research is the number of cities in Africa that had bought into the idea of greenfields developments, of a big smart city, satellite city outside of their normal scope of the city. I was very surprised by that, but perhaps also not so surprised, because I can see why that's something that construction companies and developers would want to promote as, you know, as a vision
I've
of a
seen
smart
some
city.
of these in Latin America as well. But one point that is...
And your experience?
I'm sorry?
And your impression of them in Latin America?
Well, that's mean these greenfield developments are being driven by developing country, for developing companies that want to do constructions, want to do buildings, and to do take new areas and grow, do this economic evaluation of these areas. But one thing that was interesting to me is that I recently did a research on the tenders across US and Latin America. And what was very noticeable in most of the tenders is that a great majority of the tenders were related to smart lighting.
Okay.
That was number one in all the tenders that I've seen. Cities willing to move into the smart city space, even without talking if they have a plan or they have some strategy defined for the smart city. But you will see a lot of cities moving. I need to have smart lighting. I need to have a smart lighting. So it looks to me that the smart lighting is kind of the benchmark for the cities now to do something. Have you seen that in other parts?
I think smart lighting is in some ways an obvious entry point into smart technologies. And it's an obvious entry point because it's one of those projects that can actually give real returns quickly. So the city can see savings in their electricity budget.
And the city can see what the major is doing.
Yes. So I think because of that, it's much easier for cities to engage with that. I've just produced a report. I'm coming to the end of it for you for SSC, which is entitled Simple Ways to Be Smart. And the focus there is to find, well, what are the really no-brainer smart city projects that any city can engage with? And smart lighting is definitely in there as one of them. And it is in many ways a no-brainer project because it's very well established, well proven, easy to justify the cost, easy to justify the benefits. So in many ways, I think it's a good one for cities to cut their teeth on. You know, if cities haven't engaged in smart projects before, that's a good way to start. As smart cities go, it's got all the right elements of the technology and the communication, and you can make it as sophisticated as you like, and it's easy to start small and scale up. So there's a lot of benefits to that kind of project. But it is interesting how there are definitely fashions in terms of what gets rolled out.
It's interesting because I did that small research on looking onto the tenders and check exactly what were the requirements and needs for cities. And another topic interesting is that I was discussing with a few cities in the United States and about their willingness to install gunshot detectors.
Oh, okay.
So, and when I try to discuss the same issue in Europe, everybody stares at me and says, why do we need a gunshot detector? So that's again the change in a cultural issue.
It is, yes. It's like you don't hear gunshots very often in European cities.
Yeah, sure. That was a typical US problem.
Yes, well, a problem in Johannesburg as well. So maybe it would be relevant there, but
in some areas, and in Brazil, in some areas as well, is the same situation. But I think, the trends I'm seeing, and maybe you can give me your experience, is that the three big issues in smart cities is connectivity, street lights, and mobility. So these are the ones. And something that goes together is applications around security using that basic infrastructure. So you keep on adding cameras, you keep on adding gunshot sensors, or maybe passage controls, barriers, smart fences. So these things are moving. Have you seen that also in that these are the big trends on cities around the world?
Certainly, as I say, in my experience in Africa, the access is there. And certainly the mobility, I think, is the one that has the highest profile in all the smart city literature, in all the recommendations that you read for cities. And I suppose that mobility is a very visible problem. So people in the city are very aware of mobility problems. I think also there's a lot of cool technology in mobility. And so I can see why it's an area in which there's a lot of research, there's a lot of new developments. So I can see that it would be an important area. And I think there's a range of solutions when it comes to mobility, from fairly simple things like evaluating the walkability of your streets to very complex high-tech things like the city brain that you're getting in China, which monitors traffic and then manages it through managing the traffic lights and those kind of things. So it also spans quite a range, so cities can come into it at different points, you know, if you're wanting something simpler or something more complex. I'm just trying to think what were some of the other main concerns. I mean, I think there are concerns around service delivery. So service delivery in terms of just getting more and more government services online and electronic. I think that's still very much growing in the African context, at least. And so that's a big focus area for many cities. And I'm trying to think if there were any others that sort of jump out. And then around services like electricity and water delivery and that kind of thing, managing those supply and demands.
Deliverable, yeah, good. I recently participated in a webinar where one of the discussions was a very strong statement saying that smart cities is nothing less than an evolution of eGov. And
okay.
I posed this question recently to Teresa Pardo, that you know, and she has a very interesting proposal to that. So what is your view on that movement from eGov into smart cities?
Yeah, I'd like to give that some thought, you know. I mean, I think there's a natural progression in many ways from e-government into smart cities, but I'm not sure that the two are exactly the same, because I think smart cities are trying to be much broader. In other words, not something only driven by government. So while government can drive a lot of developments in smart cities, I think there's a lot of space within a smart city for private companies or for individuals to innovate and drive their own solutions and changes within the city. Certainly, I think cities would like to think that they create a smart city plan for their city and manage the rollout of that and are in control. I think the reality is, and certainly more and more in the future, there's going to be far less centralized control. So I think, you know, if we think about some of the things that make cities smart, the fact that when I go to Porto, I can use Google Maps to navigate anywhere, and it will tell me which bus to get on and where to go and all of that kind of stuff. You know, that's an initiative that's come out of a private company, which government is now making use of by providing their bus timetables to it. Yeah. But I think there are going to be lots of developments that really go outside of maybe government's plans for the smart city.
But sorry to interrupt you about that bus issue, but the companies like Google and others that provide those timetables, they are based their solutions on information, open data that comes from the government. So that's kind of eGov 2.0. No? It's the evolution's open. So it's
Yes.
there is a linkage, although maybe very subtle, but I think that there is a linkage between eGov and this transition or this instantiation, according to Teresa, in the smart city is an instantiation of some features of eGov.
Sure. Yes, I would think that that's one way to go.
Good, interesting. So we are almost getting on the end of our time here. It's it goes fast. And there is a question that I always ask to everyone. So what will be your recommendation to that smart young mayor taking office in the next election? What shall he focus or she focus in to create in smart cities?
I think the most important thing actually is to integrate the idea of a smart city into your general planning for a city. So what I kind of have this problem with smart cities being something separate. So here's our city plan and how we're going to deal with water and crime and whatever else we're going to deal with in the city. And then we have a department over here that's the smart city department, and they're creating a vision for the smart city. I think that smart city technologies are available to use to solve any problem in the city. So I think that cities should be looking at what are challenges we face, what are the problems that we need to address, what are those priorities, and then going for each of those, what is a smart way to engage with this? What can technology do to make it easier for us? Can we collect data on this? Can we analyze data differently? Can we, engage with the problem differently? Is there some technology that will enable us to address it differently? So I would like to see the idea of smart solutions embedded across every part of the city into the planning processes and then into the operations, so that it's not an add-on. It's not a thing that you do over there. It's a thing that you do to incrementally improve your operations and to improve your service delivery.
Yeah. Well, a few years ago, we have in one of the IceGov events, we have one of the panelists saying a phrase that kept on my mind for many, many years. And he says, there will be a place for government in the future of eGov. So the question is, there will be a place for government in the future of smart cities?
Yes, I think there will be. Yeah. I mean, I think the very important role of government is to remind people that the focus is on the public good. And I think the challenge with so much of what goes on in the smart city space, but in technology developments more broadly, is that there's a lot of exciting stuff happening, and people sometimes lose sight, particularly in the private sector, of the idea of the public good and what is best for people more broadly. And so I think that really is the important role of government, is to keep scrutinizing whatever is done and say, is this in the best interest for the most people in the longer term? I think that's the kind of perspective that government needs to bring to these conversations.
Okay, good. Judy, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I asked the people that have been following us on this interview, please subscribe to our channel and click on the bell to receive notifications. And I leave you for your last words, and thank you again for your time.
Just to say thank you. It's been really interesting, and I look forward to more on this series. It's certainly an interesting collection to follow. I look forward to hearing more from colleagues working in smart cities around the world.
Okay, there will be some more interviews. Thank you very much, and see you next.
Okay, good. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.